Our speaker today is Dr. Diener. He is an assistant professor of education at Hillsdale College. He is not just a professor of education, he has spent 15 years in the trenches of K-12 private education, with 11 as an administrator and 8 of those being a headmaster of classical schools. Dr. Diener is also the executive director of the Alcuin Fellowship. This fellowship seeks to gather scholars and teachers who, through their research and training, can provide the thought leadership necessary for the 21st century renaissance of classical Christian education to grow and thrive. Please help me welcome our speaker, Dr. Diener, as he comes to present on the enterprise of learning as wonder towards wisdom.
Right, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. Thank you so much for being here. The topic of wonder is enormous, both in terms of its presence historically throughout the tradition and in terms of its importance for us today. So there's simply no way that in less than an hour, a single presentation, that I can adequately cover this topic. And to make matters even worse, if you look at the title, in addition to the topic of wonder, it also references the enterprise of learning and wisdom. So basically, that means that what I'm supposed to cover is the entire nature of education, including its starting point in wonder and its ultimate teleology in wisdom, and the relationships between them, which I can't do. However, what I hope to do is offer some non-exhaustive thoughts about these topics in 3 parts. First, I'm going to look at the nature of philosophy and its relationship to the enterprise of learning. And you might say, wait, I thought this was about wonder. Now we're bringing philosophy into it as well. Here's why. Throughout the tradition, much of the discussion of wonder takes place within the context of discussing the nature of philosophy. So if you teach history or literature or math or science or art, etc., you may think that all of this talk about wonder's role in philosophy isn't relevant to you. And what I'd like to do in this first section is try to convince you that you should care and think about wonder's role in philosophy as being generalizable to education and the enterprise of learning writ large. Okay, so that's the first part. We're going to talk a little bit about the role and the nature of philosophy. And then in the second part, I'm going to dig into the nature of wonder itself and wisdom a little bit as the starting point and the end goal of learning. And then finally, to close, I'd like to offer a few thoughts about some practical implications for us as educators as we try to cultivate wonder in our students and, as I'll point out, in ourselves, which is the first step. So let's begin with a few thoughts on the nature of philosophy. 2 definitional characteristics that historically have been attributed to the discipline of philosophy are that philosophy begins in wonder and has wisdom as its goal. So the doing of philosophy is a journey from wonder toward wisdom. And what I want to point out is that this movement from wonder toward wisdom, in fact, characterizes not just the discipline of philosophy in the narrow sense that it has become today within the university, but rather the enterprise of learning in a much broader sense. So by examining the role that wonder and wisdom play in the doing of philosophy, we all can glean insights into the enterprise of learning across whatever particular grade level or discipline you may teach. That is to say, we can look at the nature of philosophy as a lens through which to examine the enterprise of learning across all categories. If we go back in history, what we find is that the term philosophy has been understood for centuries in a much broader way than it's currently understood in contemporary academic contexts. So, for example, many times the discipline was divided into 3 main parts, 3 types of philosophy. One was divine philosophy, a second was moral philosophy, and a third was natural philosophy. Now, divine philosophy was the study of God or the gods. Today we might call that theology. Moral philosophy was the study of right and wrong, how we should live, what we should do. Today we might call this ethics. Things like political philosophy also would go under this broad category, how we should organize society, how we ought to live. And then third, natural philosophy was the study of the natural world. And today we might just call this science. Now, note that those three broad areas of inquiry are looking at basically all aspects of reality: the cosmos, the human being and the human condition, and the nature of God, or that which is transcendent. So the natural world, us, we ourselves, the study of the human, and then also the study of God. That is to say, all levels of being. Sometimes throughout the tradition, instead of this threefold distinction, there was a twofold distinction between theoretical and practical philosophy. You get this, for example, in Boethius, in his commentary on Porphyry's Isagoge. Cassiodorus makes a similar kind of division. And then sometimes it goes the other way, and you have a fourfold division. So, for example, Hugh of St. Victor makes a fourfold division of philosophy into theoretical, practical, mechanical, and logical. Now, I'm not particularly concerned with which taxonomy we use, okay? That's not really the point. The point I'm just trying to make is that, historically speaking, thinking about the nature of philosophy is something much broader than what we think of it today: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, logic, aesthetics, etc. Let me give you a few quotes to show you that this is the case from throughout the tradition. Quintilian writes that philosophy is the demonstrable, insofar as it is humanly possible, knowledge of divine and human matters. Alternatively, philosophy is the art of arts and the discipline of disciplines. Hugh of St. Victor defines philosophy as the discipline which investigates comprehensively the ideas of all things, human and divine. Again, there's really nothing that we teach in our schools that doesn't fall under this very broad, right? Comprehensively the ideas of all things. That's pretty much everything, right? And John Henry Newman in the 19th century defines philosophy as a comprehensive view of truth in all its branches, of the relations of science to science, that is, disciplines of knowledge or spheres of knowledge to each other, and of their mutual bearings and of their respective values. So what we see in all of these thinkers, again, is this understanding of philosophy as something that's incredibly broad and not limited to a specific academic discipline. Let me just give you one more kind of case study or example to show that this is the case. And that is with regard to what today we would call science, okay, which we think of as, biology and chemistry and physics and physiology and things like that. Throughout the tradition, the concept of science, as we think of it today, simply didn't exist. In the Timaeus, for example, we see the close link between science and philosophy when Plato asserts this. He says, "Our ability to see the periods of day and night, of months and of years, of equinoxes and solstices, has led to the invention of number, and has given us the idea of time and opened the path of inquiry into the nature of the universe. These pursuits have given us philosophy, a gift of the gods to the mortal race." And in his Metaphysics, Aristotle similarly describes the beginning of philosophy thus. He's talking about how philosophy first began. And he says that they wondered originally at the obvious difficulties and then advanced little by little and stated difficulties about greater matters. For example, that is, about the phenomena of the moon and those of the sun and the stars, and about the genesis of the universe. Now, what you might note about both of these quotes from Plato and Aristotle is that what we would think of as physics and mathematics, they are describing as actually being the beginning of philosophy. It really wasn't until the scientific revolution that there's this split between what we think of as science and philosophy, but it really even has come to the fore much more recently. So, for example, in 1651, Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan treats science and philosophy synonymously. If you think about great philosophers, or what we would call scientists of the scientific revolution, think of people like Copernicus, Galileo. They referred to themselves and to their fellow astronomers, past and present, not as scientists or as astronomers, but as philosophers. Okay? The term scientist wasn't actually coined until 1833. It first appeared in print in an article in the Quarterly Review in 1834. And up until thus, we see very recently people that we would call scientists simply considered themselves to be a particular type of philosopher, that is to say, natural philosophers. I'm going to stop belaboring this point, and there's a lot more that we could say about the nature of philosophy and its relationship to the other disciplines. But again, I wanted to start with this just to lay this groundwork, because a lot of the discussion of wonder within the tradition is within the context of discussing the nature of philosophy. And I want to be clear that this is something that is relevant to all of us. Okay, so in order to start working toward our goal of thinking about what it means to engage in the enterprise of learning, I'd like to briefly address two aspects of what it means to be then a philosopher, or we might say a learner. That is, where you start from, wonder, and where you are going, wisdom. Now, given that this is a conference about wonder, I'm going to spend most of my time on that theme, but let me begin with just a couple of thoughts about wisdom. Simply put, the pursuit of wisdom is the ultimate goal of philosophy. Philosophy, of course, etymologically, literally means the love of wisdom, philia and sophia. And so a philosopher is someone whose goal is the attainment of wisdom. Wisdom is the telos, or the purpose, or the goal, the end target of the entire pursuit. If we had more time, we could discuss the relationship between virtue and wisdom. That's very interesting. And all the ways in which the teleology of classical education, or the goals toward which it's directed, involve forming students who embody virtue and wisdom. Or if you like, we could say students who are equipped to live lives of human flourishing as they fulfill their purpose or function given the human nature with which they were created. Okay, there would be a lot more that we could say about that, but I'd like to turn to the topic of wonder and look at the nature of wonder. Okay, first, from the Greeks onward, it has been understood that the beginning of philosophy is wonder. So again, going the whole way back to the Theaetetus, there's a passage where there's this series of puzzles. They're talking about the nature of change, and Socrates is asking all these questions. And at one point, Theaetetus exclaims, he says, "I often wonder like mad what these things can mean. Sometimes when I'm looking at them, I begin to feel quite giddy." Right? And Socrates responds by saying, he says, "This is an experience which is characteristic of a philosopher. This wondering. That is where philosophy begins, and nowhere else." Aristotle in the Metaphysics similarly says that it's owing to their wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize. And centuries later, Thomas Aquinas says, those who first philosophized and who saw and who now philosophize did so from wonder. Okay, finally, James Shaw writes that no one can be a potential philosopher unless something moves him to wonder, unless he is struck by the being of something not himself. Okay, there's thinker after thinker after thinker within the tradition talks about philosophy in this way. One final quote that goes even farther, Albert Einstein, in his book Living Philosophy, says, "He who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe is as good as dead." Okay, so what does it mean to wonder or to marvel at something? I'd like to highlight two characteristics or aspects of wonder. And then, like I said, we'll think about some practical implications for us as educators. The first aspect, which is really a twofold aspect, I'm smuggling two into one here, is a recognition that one doesn't know something and a desire or longing to know it. Okay, so here we simultaneously have a negative and a positive aspect. When we marvel at something, or when we are filled with wonder at something, we recognize that we do not fully know or understand it, yet we are also searching for its truth and desire to understand it. And so Aristotle points out that a man who is puzzled and wonders thinks himself ignorant. There's a recognition of ignorance that's involved in wonder. In his masterpiece, Iris Exiled, Dennis Quinn articulates the historical definition of wonder thus. He says, "Wonder is the passion that arises from consciousness of ignorance, This consciousness leads to the seeking of knowledge of things in their causes. Okay, again, so you get this simultaneous ignorance, but also desire to know. Quinn later says that in true wonder, it is ignorance itself which we wish to escape. This is why wonder is the principle of philosophy and of poetry. Joseph Pieper similarly explains the nature of wonder when he writes that it is only someone who does not yet know fully who wonders. Now, I love that the way that he phrased that. And as I put there, the italics are in the original. So look at the lack of apathy here, right? So there's a simultaneous recognition that I lack something. I'm ignorant. I don't know yet. But it's not the resigned, indolent, or skeptical, I don't know, throw up my hands, who cares, right? Rather, there's an anticipation built in here. I don't know yet. That is to say, I recognize my ignorance, but I'm longing to know. Aquinas actually defines wonder as the desiderium sciendi, that is, the longing or active desire for knowledge. And supposedly, the term philosopher was coined by Pythagoras in explicit contrast to the Sophists. The Sophists were this group of itinerant teachers in the 5th century BC Athens. And of course, sophist literally just means wise one. Okay? So the idea here is that the Sophists claimed to be wise, whereas the philosophers humbly, of course, because philosophers are always very humble. You've known a few, you recognize. Okay, the philosophers only claimed to love wisdom, but they recognized that they had not yet attained it. Okay, so Hugh of St. Victor says this about this Pythagorean distinction. He says, "Fitly indeed did Pythagoras call the seekers of truth not wise men, but lovers of wisdom. For certainly the whole truth lies so deeply hidden that the mind, however much it may ardently yearn toward it, or however much it may struggle to acquire it, can nevertheless comprehend only with difficulty the truth as it is." And James Shaw similarly says this. He says, "Please God, that we all find ourselves in this condition of those who know that they do not know." I love such students, such potential philosophers, as I call them. Okay, now there's a paradoxical relationship involved here with regard to ignorance and wisdom, because as we wonder at things, we recognize our own ignorance. And as we grow toward wisdom, even as in a sense we are overcoming our ignorance, we simultaneously become even more aware of our ignorance, right? So the more you learn, the more you realize that you don't know. I remember when I was getting ready to start my PhD studies, a mentor and friend and professor of mine, he said, you're going to go through the next number of years and supposedly you're going to come out on the other side as the specialist in this very, very, very narrow branch of knowledge. But he said, just realize that the more you know, right, the bigger your circle of knowledge gets, the bigger the circumference of the circle is. That is to say, as you continue to learn and learn and learn, you realize how much outside of what you know exists that you don't know. Okay, so Quinn says that consciousness of ignorance deepens and intensifies with increasing wisdom. This is the meaning of Socrates' protestations of his own ignorance, as well as the meaning of St. Thomas Aquinas' assertion that wonder increases as we approach the truth. If wonder increases, then somehow consciousness of ignorance must increase too, for the former depends on the latter. Okay, the second aspect of what it means to wonder or to marvel at something is that it involves a sort of simplicity in response to mystery. Okay, and again, I've smuggled in a twofold aspect here. There's a kind of simplicity involved and a recognition of mystery. To wonder means to look at something that others take for granted and realize that there is a deeper meaning to it that we do not fully understand. Okay, so Joseph Pieper says that to perceive all that is unusual and exceptional, all that is wonderful in the midst of the ordinary things of daily life, that is the beginning of philosophy. Hey, Ross Inman puts it this way. He says, when we are gripped by wonder, we are startled out of the ordinary and the humdrum of human existence. When rightly ordered, wonder can indicate to us that we are in the presence of something truly excellent and worthy of our sustained attention. Wonder is also a window through which we can see reality in its proper light. Wonder, in other words, involves a recognition of the mysteriousness of reality. Einstein said that the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source, he said, of all true art and science. So in wonder, we recognize the mysterious nature of reality. But again, kind of paradoxically, that wonder often seems simplistic because it is in response to quite ordinary, quotidian aspects of reality. That is to say, wonder-filled learners look at things that others take for granted and ask deep questions about them. So Quinn says, although wonder arises with consciousness of ignorance of some high knowledge, the actual objects that may stimulate wonder may be very small and ordinary. The very existence of all human science testifies to the inexhaustible wonder of the universe, most of it being simply what we see about us every day. Okay, so for example, all of us know what equilateral triangles are, right? Unless you failed geometry class, or circles, okay? Or line segments, things like this, the basic shapes of geometry. Here's the weird thing. None of us has ever seen one. By definition, you can't draw a circle because it's an infinite series of points, and as soon as you draw it and put ink on a page, it's no longer a point. None of us has ever seen an equilateral triangle, or a line segment for that matter. Now, you might just say, oh, who cares? It's insignificant. But philosophers look at this and say, wait a minute. There's something funny going on here, right? How is it that we all understand something that none of us has ever seen? Where did we get the idea of a perfectly equilateral triangle or a circle? Do perfect circles and equilateral triangles actually exist anywhere in the universe or not? Or another example, we use terms like truth and justice and goodness all the time. We think we know what they mean. But for centuries, philosophers have been trying to figure out exactly what do we mean by these terms. Right? This is what got Socrates killed. Right? He's walking around in the agora saying, oh, you know something about this, right? Yes, of course I know something. Well, can you give me a definition? And then, like sometime later when the person's just so frustrated and flummoxed, they just throw up their hands and give up, right? You've confounded me, right? You messed me up. Gorgias says at one point, I used to give speeches about this. Now I don't know what to say. Okay? So one more example here from natural philosophy or science. Think about Newton watching apples falling and starting to ask questions about the ordinary phenomenon that had been going on for thousands of years. Now, the legend is, of course, that Newton was sitting under a tree and got hit on the head by an apple and went, ooh, gravity, which is an embellishment. That's not exactly how it happened. But Newton himself did say that he started thinking about gravitation after watching an apple fall from a tree, okay? So what made Newton different? For thousands of years, people had been watching apples fall from trees. What happened with Newton that was unique is that he saw in this very daily occurrence something that he couldn't explain. Aristotle had taught, in terms of the Aristotelian physics, that when a force is applied constantly to an object, the object moves at a constant speed, and that when the force is removed, the object turns to rest. Now, that makes sense. If I start pushing this podium across the stage, right, as long as I'm pushing on it, it will move, and when I take my hand off it, it will stop. So that makes sense. But what Newton recognized is that Aristotle's theory of motion didn't adequately explain the apple. Where was the force coming from that pushed the apple down toward the ground and that continued to push even once the apple had left the tree? Wait, what's going on here? It's not touching anything. Okay, now these are just a couple of simple examples about how to wonder at something is to see an aspect of reality that might seem obvious to most people, and then with a sort of simplicity, recognize that there's actually deep mystery going on. Hey, this is part of the reason why children often seem naive or simplistic. Children are often the best philosophers because they are the ones who are filled with wonder. Hey, consider, for example, the small child who is transfixed by the fact that a helium balloon goes up instead of down. That's crazy, right? Everything in their child's experience has fallen toward the earth. And then they see this thing that sort of magically is going up. And the rest of us are like, yeah. Stop looking at balloons. We have to get you to school. You're going to be late. You got to go learn stuff. Doesn't make any sense. Right? We have to remember to give children time to marvel at these things, to wonder at these things. John Donne writes this in poetic form. He says, "There is nothing that God hath established in a constant course of nature, and which therefore is done every day, but would seem a miracle and exercise our admiration if it were done but one. The motion of the sun were a greater wonder than the standing still, if it all were to begin again, and only the daily doing takes off the admiration." Hey, in other words, the world is full of things that should evoke wonder in us. And children are often the best at this because they haven't yet lost their sense of wonder. They haven't gotten accustomed to the things that we take for granted. They're not afraid of asking simplistic questions that we just assume answers to. Okay? Now, before I move on to some practical implications, I would like to briefly highlight two other truths about the nature of wonder. The first one is that wonder is a fundamental and deep part of the human condition. Okay? It is a fundamentally human activity. Experiences of wonder help us to understand who we are and the place that we have in the universe. So Inman says it this way: wonder is a distinctly human response, precisely because it is a kind of intellectual, moral, and aesthetic response to reality. It is a response to reality that is saturated with intellectual and moral longing and fulfillment. Human beings have a unique appetite for wonder. We are wonder hungry, we might say. And he goes on later to write that a desire to philosophize is as natural to us as our desire to eat, drink, and live in community. Since we are meaning-seeking animals by nature, our natural appetite to make sense of it all is not the sort of hunger we can choose to take up and put down as we see fit, no more than we can dispense with our natural appetite for food when we wish to do so. Okay, so just think about this for a second. If wonder is a unique and indispensable aspect of living a rich and meaningful human life, which it is, and if classical education is teleologically oriented toward helping students to live rich and meaningful human lives, which it is, then what follows? As classical educators, we should, by definition, include the cultivation of wonder in our students as a core part of what we do. Okay, so this is one aspect of the nature of wonder. It's just part of what it means to be human. Hey, recall what Einstein says, that he who has lost the sense of wonder is as good as dead. Okay, and then secondly, wonder engenders humility. Wonder engenders humility. Joseph Pieper says it this way: since the very beginning, philosophy has always been characterized by hope. Philosophy never claimed to be a superior form of knowledge, but on the contrary, a form of humility, and restrained and conscious of this restraint and humility in relation to knowledge. The words philosopher and philosophy were coined, according to legend, this antique legend by Pythagoras, which I mentioned earlier, in explicit contrast to the words Sophia and Sophos. No man is wise and no man knows. God alone is wise and all-knowing. At the very most, a man might call himself a lover of wisdom and a seeker after knowledge, that is, a philosopher. Now, when we encounter the mysterious and we come to understand rightly our place in the cosmos, we realize how much we don't understand. Right? We become increasingly aware of our own ignorance, and we also realize how small we are in the vastness of reality. And this should engender humility in us. Hey, it turns out that what researchers call the small self effect, okay, this effect when you realize how small you are, this small self effect is incredibly psychologically beneficial. Okay? This is a benefit of wonder. So many experiences of wonder put us into contact with the realities that are truly awe-inspiring and worthy of our reverence and respect. These experiences remind us that our own existence is fragile and radically dependent on factors that are largely outside of our control, right? And it shouldn't come as any surprise, therefore, that according to one study on this small self-effect, I'm quoting here, people who are more dispositionally prone to experiencing awe were rated as more humble by their friends. So if you want to be rated as humble, well, go wonder at things. People who reported feeling more awe over the course of 2 weeks also reported feeling more humble. Now, I think this is insightful for us because students in classical schools are known for being smart, right? I work at Hillsdale College. We have a lot of students that come to us from classical schools. During my many years in K-12 classical education, I saw this as well. Classical school students are really smart. You know what one of the chief criticisms that's made of them sometimes is, though? They're not humble. They think they're smart. And they graduate as 18-year-olds and they think they've got everything all figured out, right? And they don't realize how ignorant they are and how much more there is to learn. So this is an important point because if we are leading students in experiences of wonder, as I'm trying to unpack it for us here today, those experiences should lead our students toward a deep humility as they recognize the smallness of what they are in the grander scope of things. Okay, so with all of this in mind, I'd like to close by considering 3 practical implications for us as educators, and then we'll have some time for Q&A or comments that you may have. So what can we do as teachers, as administrators, working with students? Well, first of all, in order to lead students well in the enterprise of learning and cultivating wonder in them, we must be intentional about cultivating a sense of wonder in ourselves. Hey, so the first step of all of this is marvel yourself. Now, one of the most difficult things about or challenges that we experience today as educators in our contemporary context is that we and our students alike, largely due to our immersion in various forms of media, but there are other causes as well, we have been drastically dulled in our ability to truly marvel at simple things and be amazed by them. We live in a world of digitally enhanced everything, from pictures of landscapes, to music, to special effects movies, to the bodies of models, and the list could go on and on and on. And it is difficult to maintain a simple sense of wonder and not need continually more sensationalism. So I'd like to challenge us as educators first on this point. We have to cultivate a sense of wonder in ourselves. Joseph Pieper writes that our sense of wonder in the philosophical meaning of the word is not aroused by enormous sensational things, though that is what a dulled sensibility requires to provoke it to an experience of wonder. A man who needs the unusual to make him wonder shows that he has lost the capacity to find the true answer to the wonder of being. The itch for sensation is a sure indication of a bourgeois mind and a deadened sense of wonder. So I think we should ask ourselves today, do we itch for sensation? Do we need more and more and more in order to feel engaged with the world? Or are we filled with wonder by what many people consider ordinary? When was the last time you just watched the path of a leaf as it falls from a tree, for example. Like, that's crazy. The number of forces involved and how it moves and the kind of capriciousness, but also directedness with which a leaf falls. Okay. Shaw similarly writes, he says that we live in a world surrounded by noise, by a kind of strident unrest that fills our days and nights. We have so many things to distract us, even if sometimes we think they might educate us. That's interesting. We find the time first by becoming interested, by longing to know. So, are you constantly distracted by the noise around you? Or are you intentional about pushing aside distractions so that you can truly wonder? In his book, Only the Lover Sings, Pieper says this: the average person of our time loses the ability to see because there's nothing to see. Because there is so much to see, right? We're inundated, and being inundated by so much to see actually deadens our ability to see, paradoxically. There does exist, he says, something like visual noise, which, just like the acoustical counterpart, makes clear perception impossible. The restoration of man's inner eyes can hardly be expected in this day and age unless, first of all, one were willing and determined simply to exclude from one's realm of life all those inane and contrived but titillating illusions incessantly generated by the entertainment industry. So be intentional about cultivating your own sense of wonder. Put down your phone. Be quiet. Don't become accustomed to the visual noise that makes clear perception impossible. Be intentional about being filled with wonder, about recognizing your own ignorance, about longing to understand something that you don't know, about being filled with the willingness to appear simplistic and naive as you gaze upon the mysterious aspects of reality. I would put before us this morning that we can't cultivate wonder effectively in our students unless we ourselves also are filled with wonder. So let's be intentional. Second point, marvel yourself and then model wonder. I would just encourage us today to be intentional about modeling a sense of wonder for our students. This doesn't mean we have to be showy or ostentatious, but we can give them an example to follow of an adult who's wiser than they are, hopefully we are, and yet who continues to pursue wisdom through marveling at the mysteries of reality. Model wonder for your students, for example, by admitting your ignorance about something that you don't fully understand, or by excitedly telling them about something that you're learning. Right? It doesn't have to even be relevant to the class you're teaching. Demonstrate this, what Aquinas called the desiderium sciendi, this longing or desire to know, such that they see embodied in you the truth that the enterprise of learning as wonder toward wisdom doesn't stop when the school day ends, or when the school year ends, or when they graduate from your school, but rather that this is a deeply, intrinsically human endeavor that continues for the rest of their lives. Model for your students what it means to be a wise and yet humble learner who, no matter how much you understand, recognizes that there is always more to learn and there are always aspects of reality that are beyond your grasp. Okay, I think within the context of the classroom, we have to remind ourselves to approach the curriculum that we're teaching with a sense of wonder. Why? Because unless you're a first-year teacher, you've taught it all before, right? And after we teach something for years and years, it can take effort to see it with fresh eyes and present it to students as something marvelous that should fill them with wonder. So I'm sure we could all give examples of this. I thought of a few from my own life. I remember where I was standing as an elementary student in the basement of our home when my dad taught me that you can cross multiply and divide fractions in order to solve proportions. And I was like, that's awesome. I thought it was so cool. Okay? Now I'm like, Of course, that's what you do, right? I remember the time when I was in high school, the first time that a teacher showed the connection between physics and calculus. Calc-based physics, I studied calculus, I knew about physics, and I saw the connections between them, and I was like, my mind blew. That is unbelievable, right? The derivatives, you can go from, from the velocity to acceleration, whatever. Like, this is so cool how this is all connected. Okay? Or the first time in college when I had the realization that underlying all systematic theologies are certain philosophical assumptions about metaphysics and epistemology. Okay, we could all give examples like this. We could all think of things where we learned it for the first time and were filled with wonder, but now it's become commonplace. And so after you teach it year after year after year, you have to remember that your students are seeing it for the first time. And it takes effort for us to present it to them in a way that fills them with wonder instead of just being, the next lesson of the next chapter of the book that you're reading. Quinn points out that although it's true that repetition tends to dull the sense of wonder, the poet and the philosopher testify that some are able to overcome the tendency. Teachers who treat the same subject over and over again, if they are to be effective, have to overcome the wonder-dulling effects of repetition. They have, of course, the ignorant, and one hopes, the fresh-eyed young to help keep their own wonder alive. So like the prisoner of Plato's allegory of the cave who has been freed, we as teachers have to be willing to go back down into the cave, as it were, to meet our students in their darkness, even though we've seen the light of reality, and then lead them up that long and arduous path. And finally, then, make space for wonder. So if we're cultivating wonder in ourselves and we're being intentional about modeling our sense of wonder for our students, my last encouragement here for us today would be to look for places in our curriculum, time in the school day, where we can intentionally make space for our students to wonder. The things that we are teaching day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, are so full of mystery that merit wonder. From the nature of irrational numbers and geometric shapes, like I mentioned, to mysteries like the incarnation, from a newborn baby to the rock strata in the Grand Canyon just a couple hours north of here, to the physics of subatomic particles, to the nature of love as expressed in a poem, or human nature, who we are as human persons, right? All of these are fundamental aspects of reality that are beyond our grasp. And given that truth, a posture of wonder is completely appropriate. But if you teach your students in a way that conveys to them that the content is the most important thing, and that increasing their knowledge and mastery of the world is what you really care about, then what you're teaching to students, tacitly or implicitly, is that marveling at mystery is really nothing but a whimsical fancy and ultimately a waste of their time. So in addition to cultivating wonder within yourself and modeling it for your students, be intentional about giving them opportunities to wonder. Now, obviously, this will look different in different subjects at different grade levels, across, depending on what you teach, but it can be done across all grades and all disciplines. So here are just a couple of examples. Show students a picture or a painting of something beautiful in the natural world and ask them to reflect on what it teaches them about the nature of themselves and their place in the cosmos. Ask a question and then make them wait 30 seconds or a minute to quietly reflect before they offer an answer. Now just think about that. If you stopped 5 to 10 times a day for 30 seconds and you said, I want you to just reflect on this before you say anything, if you did that 5 to 10 times for 30 seconds in a day, you would not lose that much of your precious instructional time. Right? Do the math. It's not that much time, but I would put before you that if you did that, you would radically transform the way that you're showing students how to engage in the learning process. They would be able to marvel and to contemplate and to be filled with wonder in a way that they can't when you're constantly pushing them. In addition to a test question or test questions that ask students to demonstrate what they know, Ask them a question about something they don't understand, but would like to learn more about. Final illustration, maybe less conversation inducing than the final illustration last night. Green peppers. I know an art teacher who gave a senior art class a slice of green pepper. And she said, I want you to paint this. And the seniors were very good artists. They had been studying, painting for a long time. And they were kind of confused. Like, it's just a slice of green pepper. It's not that big of a deal. I mean, there's a shape and you paint it green. And then they started to look and they started to observe and they started to be filled with wonder at how much texture and color variation and little lines and nuance and complexity and mystery was going on in this little piece of a sliced vegetable sitting on the table in front of them, right? That's an example of how you develop wonder in your students. Okay? So again, we could come up with lots and lots of examples, and it's going to look different depending on the grade level or the subject that you teach. But to conclude then, let's recognize that the enterprise of learning begins in wonder and is directed toward wisdom. Let's consider carefully the nature and the importance of wonder, and let's be intentional about cultivating wonder both in ourselves and in our students. This is a central part of the enterprise of learning, and it's something that we all should be paying, I think, probably more attention to than we do. Thank you. Okay, we do have a few minutes for questions, comments, Rotten Tomatoes. So if anyone has something that you'd like to offer, please come to the mic and would love to hear from you. Yes.
Thank you for that great talk. You mentioned having that experience of the cross curriculum between the calculus and the physics. And I'm just wondering as a teacher, because we so often try to show the students the connections between the different subjects they're learning. But obviously, there are students who are not always as excited about those connections as you were with the example you gave. So I'm just picturing a student, kind of devil's advocate, saying, Mr. Turco, why even bring that up? That there's a connection between why do you keep bringing up these connections? What, kind of looking at the bigger picture, what should my answer be?
Yeah, that's great. So one thought would be, even the student who's skeptical or doesn't get it, just keep on modeling the love of wonder, right? Because this is so awesome. And sometimes we plant seeds. Wendell Berry says that teaching is an act of faith. You don't know whether you're being effective. He says at one point, Berry says that the effects of a teacher might pop out decades down the road in the life of some child or grandchild, right? So it might be that student at the end of the year still doesn't get it, but it might be that next year or in 30 years, they do. So we should continue to model and have faith in the seeds we're planting. The other thing I would just say, and maybe this would be convincing to such a student, or maybe it wouldn't be, is that the way that we divide the disciplines is artificial. And the reality is a whole. Reality is a whole that we learn about through the different sciences or the different branches of knowledge, which are all united and interconnected. And if the student is intellectual and wants to read about that, there's lots of stuff you could look at within the tradition. John Henry Newman in The Idea of a University makes a great argument for this, the way that all the disciplines balance. And he says, this is the Jerry Maguire moment, you complete me. He says they correct and complete each other such that one is incomplete without the others. And whether it's art and music and philosophy and history or the natural world and other things, I think you can give examples to show how that's the case. That if you try to understand reality, if you try to understand the nature of human love only through the discipline of cognitive science or only through the discipline of history or only through the discipline of math, etc., you'll be missing part of it. So we need all of the disciplines. I hope that would be helpful to such a student. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for sharing some of yourself with us. Do you mind connecting wondering to the development of virtue? Thank you.
Good. So, yeah. So for the next hour, we'll be talking about virtue. Okay, here's one way of making the connection. Virtue, as understood throughout the tradition, is not just moral virtue, right? There are other virtues as well, intellectual virtues, etc. And if you look at, for example, the Greek word arete or the Latin virtus, that whence we get virtue, it's the idea is the ability of a thing to fulfill its purpose or function, right? So it's not just doing the right stuff, but it's actually sort of actualizing what you were made to do. Okay, so Aristotle talks about the nature of a horse, or the virtue of a horse being able to run into battle and not shy away, or the virtue of the eyes. Basil the Great talks about the virtue of the fruit tree is to be laden with fruit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so if we think about virtue in this broad sense of what we're trying to do, as we say we're trying to cultivate virtue, is to help students live in accordance with their nature. I would say that being beings who are filled with wonder is a part of our nature. That's a fundamental part of human condition in the world, such that if we don't do that, we're actually not cultivating them in a way that will lead to virtue in that broad sense. Does that make sense as a connection between the two?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. And one of the definitions that you gave that stood out to me was that wonder is the recognition of ignorance and the longing to know. I've noticed with my ninth graders, they've got that first part in spades, and that's actually one of my favorite things about them. They recognize their own ignorance, but I notice it's harder to come by the longing to know. And sometimes it's spontaneous, it just hits. Symbolism catches their eye, and they're just captivated. But I'm wondering if there have been some practical strategies that you use to cultivate that out more, even in the things that appear to be mundane to them at first.
That's really great. So, well, congratulations, first of all, on having students who recognize their own ignorance. Not all students do, so that's a good start. Yeah, different students are different in terms of this longing to know. Part of it, I think, is, like I said before, you keep trying, and sometimes you might not see the fruit. By asking them questions about things that maybe they think they know. So if they recognize their own ignorance and they're like, well, I don't know, who cares? If you can find something that they think they know about and then push them to dig deeper, sometimes that helps them to both recognize their own ignorance, but also then to see that there's more that they need to learn. Like, I think I know what I'm talking about, but there's actually more. The other thing which can be difficult, again, I don't know what grade level, but is to start with things that they care about. So sometimes if we're talking about, you should love to learn about the connections between calculus and physics, and they're like, I don't care. I write poems and songs. I just want to be a musician my whole life. And what do I care about physics? Okay, well, for example, if we can then start to push on things that they really do care about and show them how learning about those things will help, or how if they have a longing to know about those things, it will actually help them in the areas that they would like to grow in. So identifying where they're at. Again, each set of students is different and each individual student is different, but that would maybe be a start. Yes?
I believe this lady over here.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi. So I'm on the point about modeling wonder. I'm a history teacher, and I am very aware that history teachers vary a lot in what they wonder at. And what are you modeling? Are you modeling a kind of sort of superior awareness that these people in the past were making terrible errors that we people who are so much wiser would never make? So I think that it connects to your notion about humility, but I think that we need to be very aware that we need to be modeling something that is directed toward the good or toward the generous, toward, I don't know. I just wonder what you're thinking about. You haven't really given us an example from the history classroom. I would love to hear you apply your ideas there, if you would.
Yeah, that's a great example. So one thing I would say is that through the study of history, if we approach history in this kind of supercilious, like you're saying, we're going to look down and criticize or learn which decisions were right and wrong and which, why all these people thought these horrible things or whatever. That's actually not nearly as helpful as if we approach history with a sense of, with a desire to understand why things happened the way they did, or why people thought the way they did. And a lot of times, we think that we're so smart, or that we've progressed so far, and through studying important actions or figures or texts from history, we actually see universal things that exist within our own hearts as well. So, you can study, for example, demagoguery in ancient politics, or the ways that mobs form, and then look at contemporary events, or the way our own opinions form through digital media, for example, and say, are there connections here? Why was it that this person was able to convince so many people to go down this bad path? What was compelling about that? Have you found those inclinations in your own heart? And so if we start to draw connections, and that's actually a humble way of approaching history, to learn about ourselves through it, instead of just using it as a kind of material for making judgments. That would be one starting point with regard to history specifically. Thank you. Yes.
So in Aristotle's Metaphysics, he brings up an example of wonder that first you might wonder that the diagonal is incommensurable with the side, but then after you complete the demonstration, you would wonder that it could ever be otherwise. That's what seems wondrous. So I'm curious about these two kinds of wonder: the wonder that doesn't survive learning or gets transformed through learning, and then the wonder that remains. I still find it quite wondrous that the diagonal is incommensurable with the side, even though I've done the proof many times. So maybe a difference between wondering at versus wondering about, wondering at the that versus wondering about the why.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to think about. I think that this is tied up in this paradox of knowledge and mystery, and that the more you learn about something, again, I'm going back to this image of the expanding circle. The more you learn about something, the more you realize that you don't know. So in the example of a mathematical principle, you wonder at something, and then you learn the answer to it, but then in learning the answer, you realize, wait a minute, now there's something else marvelous that I didn't even realize before, and now this is blowing my mind. So there's a kind of sequential, cyclical relationship between, in one sense, overcoming the wonder, right? And in another sense, but you overcome the wonder in a way that then often leads to further iterations, as your deepened understanding then leads you to new levels of wonder. Right? I mean, I think of the way that C.S. Lewis in The Last Battle, further up and further in, right? We continue to move further and further, and even as we achieve in some sense knowledge of the world, continue, if we have the right disposition, to be filled with wonder at the deeper aspects of reality. All right? Well, one more question. Last question. Go ahead.
Sorry, this one's been sticking in my head. I love the connection of humility and wisdom, but in working with kids, how do we take those steps to show that humility is good, that is the thing to be pursuing in a culture where it's the rock stars and it's the quarterbacks, and that humility is not there, but that's where everybody wants to be. Just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's going to depend on what kind of school you're in. So if you are able to speak in explicitly religious terms, right? Obviously, talking about humility and the role of leadership through sacrifice is there, right? There are lots of examples within the tradition, even in non-explicitly religious contexts, where that idea of humbling oneself in order to be exalted is present. And if that doesn't work, maybe the social science data on human flourishing metrics of those who are humble would be. I'm sort of kidding. Like you should be humble because your life will be better because of it. No, but I mean there is a reality, right? That part of human existence is the reality that when we humble ourselves in community, humility is necessary for quality friendships, quality marriages, quality societies. You can't have those. You can have the famous athlete or entertainer who, by the way, usually has a miserable life and is not very happy. And sometimes students are able to recognize that. Like, yeah, that's actually not the kind of life I want. But you can't have a society full of those people. Or if we all were like that, it would be horrible. So helping students to see that in order for their family to work, or for society to work, or for friendships to work, there has to be this encounter with the other that involves humility, maybe a window into helping them see that's something worth striving toward. So thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy the conference. Thank you.